Hello, I'm Douglas Smith. I'm with Whiskies of the World. Tonight, I thank you for joining us here for our American Single Malts tasting. This evening, it's all about American Single Malts. What is this category and why do we have it? Why do we need it? So the American Single Malt is similar in definition to Scotch, to what we expect. It's 100% barley. It's one distillery, made in the USA, matured in oak cask, distilled to no more than 80% ABV, bottled at least 40% ABV. So each of our celebrities we have here this evening are going to take a talking point and talk to us about the American Single Malts and why this category is exciting and why we need it and what it's all about and what we hope to create with it. So in our tasting here, we are going to go through 10 malts that are distinctly different and distinctly American made. So this is going to be a total of 5 ounces of liquid here. That is equivalent to over 3 drinks in 1 hour. So I recommend taking half your sample, not the whole thing, so you have to revisit later. That way you can hold out with us till the end. So right now, we have we have our 10 brands here. We have Balcones, we have Jared Hempstead, the distiller for Balcones. We have Colkegan, the founder distiller for Colkegan. We have Christian Krogstad with Westward Single Malt, or with Westward. We have Jason Jorgensen with Ali 6. We have Paul Halactico with, sorry if I got that wrong, with a few single malts, or with few spirits. We have Stefan Paul with the Del Back. And we have Virag Saxena with 10th Street. So we're going to start out here with our Balcones. So if you want to pour your Balcones malt there, and we'll have Jared's going to talk to us about the Balcones, how it's made, what their techniques are, and he's going to talk to us about the importance of the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission.
Are you starting with number 1?
So this is going to be Balcones. The numbers are not necessarily, the numbers are there just to keep you alert. But what we're starting with is, we're going in the order of the tasting notes, which was sent out. So Balcones Single Malt will be the first one.
That's number 3, correct?
Let's see what we got here.
Yeah, that's what I have.
Correct, yeah.
So Jerry.
Yeah. I always forget, luckily everyone else does too, what year that was that we met in Chicago, for people that weren't a part of that founding meeting of 9 distilleries that met up in Chicago to start these conversations about forming a group. And in some ways it's not very complicated. We were all doing a lot of work on this category. For some people like Colin or Westland, that's single malt is all they do. And needless to say, for the last decade, and some people on here have been doing it even longer than that. There's a lot of education, a lot of advocacy with the trade, liquor stores, bars, you name it, distributors, to educate and promote this category. We were all doing the same work, just doing it individually. And so the idea of coming together and kind of duplicating, where 1 and 1 equals more than 2, pooling resources and pooling connections, and having a more unified voice to go address the growth and education around this category. Not everybody is super excited about more legislation or more boundaries. One of the main things we've looked at is kind of precedent in some other situations around the globe, in America and abroad, with other spirit types that have struggled because they didn't have any kind of formal protections. Obviously, we all can see what's going on with Japanese whiskey, and a really high profile, highly respected category that now all of a sudden doesn't mean anything because there's not a whole lot of definition and kind of boundaries on what that actually means. And the other, most recently for craft distillers, was the barrel-aged gin fiasco. You build something that's got enough momentum that isn't supposed to exist or isn't, recognized, and eventually someone is going to decide what it means. And we just thought it would be really smart to get out ahead of that and be protecting what consumers understand single malt to mean globally, historically, as well as protecting all the innovation and creativity that American distillers making American single malt we're currently doing. So, we didn't want to get stuck with a definition that requires a lot of us to change what we do or is completely inconsistent with what global malts have been. And I know Steve always likes to say, I think we scheduled 3 or 4 hours at Benny's, and we ended up taking about 30, 40 minutes before we agreed on everything. There wasn't a whole lot of fighting. And then we spent the rest of the time drinking beer. So Colin was there, Paul was there, Christian was there. I'm trying to think of who else that maybe is on here that was there that day. But since then, we've gone from those 9 to I think we're up to over 160 producers that have joined the commission, agreeing to the standard of identity that we've proposed. And at least in theory, that means they're either already released or are going to release a single malt that fits that definition. And there's also room for trade partners. Steve is in the middle of getting our I think it's 501c6 set up. And there'll be a lot more opportunities for glass manufacturers and cooperages and anyone else that wants to get involved and kind of pledge support and see if we can't help move this thing down the road. We do have pretty good indication as far as legislative update. We all know we didn't make the last round of published changes that the TTB made, but we've been in contact with them a bunch, and we have every reason to think that this is kind of rolling out in stages and that we have not been forgotten, and it's very high on everyone's list. For anybody who doesn't realize, Discus actually copy and pasted our definition in their response during the comment time earlier this year, which could seem threatening because that probably means they're planning, somebody at Discus is planning to get in this American single malt game. But that's something we can worry about later once we actually get it accomplished and get it, over the goal line. So, yeah, I think it's severely important. We don't want to end up where rum has been, and for the last forever, watching Richard Seal and some of those folks struggle to make sure there's some boundaries around what those designations mean. We don't want to go the barrel aged gin route where someone else decides, and all of a sudden everybody who likes American single malt and everybody who makes it looks at this definition and goes, where the hell did this come from? This doesn't make any sense.
Okay, so now let's see why we want to protect this. Let's take a taste of your single malt.
Yeah, so our flagship single malt, which is what I'm assuming you've got, just our one single malt, is Scottish barley. So this is Golden Promise. We get directly from the Simpsons family. It's kind of intentionally a hybrid in the sense that even though we are excluding, new oak as a requirement for American single malt, that's mostly what we use in this. And it was kind of an intentional creative decision to kind of keep a foot in both traditions. So we have a very familiar wood profile and oak maturation, and with very traditional Scottish barley on four-side stills, lagered, the whole deal. So it's pretty traditional up until the point it hits the barrel, and then from there it's pretty American. So we use it a lot to kind of see if we can get some of these people that swear they're bourbon guys and only bourbon guys and don't like single malts to kind of start that conversation of a path that's somewhere in between what they're familiar with. Scotch being, and Irish whiskey being, and Japanese whiskey being. But so yeah, there's a lot of wood. We get heads that are a lot more solventy and a lot more American in some ways. Plenty of wood sugar and tannin on it, and spice. There's always like some cinnamon on the end. Yeah, and the fruits tend to be pretty cooked down, pretty caramelized. Some orchardy stuff, maybe a little bit stone fruit in there. This is at 106. Anybody who's using pot stills, we're not doing any chill filtering or anything. We bought a little bit higher proof. We're big fans of texture and mouthfeel. Although I hear mouthfeel is like the new smooth, like no one's into saying mouthfeel anymore. I don't know. But yeah, texture and kind of weight is a big deal to us. We work a lot on blends, making sure that the body's right and that it can kind of tolerate a bigger finish when you've got some kind of lingering coating, oily and sweet stuff hanging around. Yeah.
Okay, well that's definitely a lovely gram. Always does well in the competitions. Next, we're going to move on to Colkegan. Colin's going to talk to us about What the commission wants to protect the label as American Single Malt to be made in America. So, Colin, if you can.
Hey everybody, hopefully you got your Colkegan in front of you, but I know our distribution isn't all over the place, and maybe everybody doesn't have some, but thanks for having us on, Douglas, and thanks for everybody else for being here. It's an esteemed group to be in. Yeah, the commission really was formed to sort of protect the category of American Single Malt. We really don't see ourselves as policemen going around telling people you can't do that, you can do this. The way we like to talk about it is more of an inclusive group. The Scottish Whisky Association, good guys, I'm sure that they are, do pride themselves on being an exclusive group of single malts, or Scottish whiskies, I should say. We like to think of ourselves as inclusive. A good example of that is my whiskey. It's aged in new oak and in used oak, and I mesquite smoke some of the grain at the beginning there. So, you know, the mesquite smoking's fine, but the fact that I'm using new and used oak really would be hard to put into a category that was really restrictive. So I'm glad to be in a group I can join in with. We want to be able to also, as well as have some boundaries put on what we do. You know, so we can, it's not up to us to control the quality, but we're, the restrictions, and I think, you know, both Jared and Christian and Paul have talked plenty about this. They're not too strict that you couldn't really experiment within that category. It's definitely about being into an experiment, but still trying to make sure we're all producing good stuff. So when you see a label on it that says Pure American Single Malt, you know you're going to get a good stuff there, a good bottle. And also, as Jared would talked about a bit, you defining a category is also going to be able to give us a place in liquor stores. You know, if you're, I mean, we hate to even all admit, but everybody needs to be in Total Wine these days. They're going to have the delineations that are given to them for a category. Japanese single malts have one, believe it or not, and there's only a few around. There's 160 of us without a category. And I think being able to say American Single Malt, instead of just being American whiskies, which is a sort of catch-all, there's some great American whiskies, but I think single malts being able to have their own category would be a great space in a liquor store. So that's a little bit of a talk on the commission. Did I answer all the question, Doug?
So, and why don't we call it malt whiskey?
Well, malt whiskey could be made, is it up to 51%, I believe. We're trying to aim for 100% of a single malt.
Right. So I mean that's kind of the TBV rules is that it's got to be 51% malt and put into new oak barrels, and so that just doesn't work for what everybody wants to do. So we're trying to create the American Single Malt. Basically, you know, people know what it is. They have the they know it's 100%. They know it's a certain kind of quality.
Yeah.
So, but the big fight there is to relax, or to make sure you can use whatever type of barrels you want. I understand some people have trouble getting their products labels approved. Some people don't. I guess it depends on who you get at the TTB to approve your labels. But you know, the fact is we want to have new or used oak.
Yeah,
so
another reason we're trying to do, sorry, go on.
Yeah. Next, so this is clearly a different taste profile from our last one. It's a bit lighter, but please tell us your technical on your malt.
So a third of the grain in
You're
this
up to number 4.
I believe it's number. No, it's number 9. This one. This is number 9.
You got to be real clear which ones we're drinking.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah. So we are on number 9, the Colkegan malt.
Colkegan malt whiskey.
Sample number 9.
Yeah. Quick descriptor. You heard me talk before. There you go. That's the one, Jared. Thank you. It's a Mesquite smoked single malt. So a third of the grain is smoked for us by Breeze Malting House, and 2/3 is unsmoked. BSG, regular 2-row raw barley, aged for a minimum of 3 years. Now, this is another conversation we'll get Jared onto later. We heat and humidify our warehouse. Yeah, Jared's shaking his head. At 7,500 feet with very little rainfall, it's so dry and no humidity, and our angel shares over 12% a year, even in a humidified warehouse. So we're working on that. We're still ambivalent as to whether we might stop doing that, but minimum 3 years, a third mesquite smoke, and typically it really depends on the tasting that goes into we do a 15-barrel blend to put it all together. Typically 5 of the barrels are new oak, so that oak can help compete with the smoke a bit to homogenize our flavor so we can keep Colkegan the same. Our goal is really to be just a little older each time, but to keep the flavor profile the same. We've got some other whiskeys that we can play around with and play with the flavor profile. And that's the little story on Colkegan. Thank you for drinking.
It's beautiful. Yeah, it is. There are just a few places you can pick up your Colkegan, and you want to talk about the other expressions that are available. You can get it at Bitters a bottle. Bitters, basically in the Bay Area, Bitters and bottles. You can also get it from Shovels Bar. So, but it is available. It'll take several days to order it, but put in your orders and you can try. Or you can always get a flight of these whiskeys, ounce flights from the bar to try them out before you buy the full bottle. So next we're going to move on. So now we're moving to Westward. Christian Krogstad is going to talk to us about why the commission wants us to be able to use any type of oak, or any type of oak cask.
Yeah, any type of oak. When we set this up, the idea was that when we set up the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission back, I think it was 2016, Jared. Anyway, yeah, about 5 years ago. Our idea was that, we wanted to have some guardrails on the category so that, so that it had some, so that people knew where to put it, so that there was a category for the distributors, for the media, for the retailers, but we wanted it to be really broad, broad categories that allowed for a lot of innovation. And so we wanted to allow new or used casks. We wanted to allow column stills or pot stills. And so by, getting away from, so there had already existed the category of malt whiskey and straight malt whiskey, but they, just like with bourbon and rye, they just have to be 51% barley malt, but for straight malt whiskey, it had to be aged in new oak barrels, and we didn't want to force that on anyone. So we have, we typically use new charred oak, white oak barrels from Kentucky and Missouri and so forth. But we also use some used barrels, and we use the different styles of barrels for different effects. There also aren't any restrictions around finishes. So, some of our members, some American Single Malts are finished or even aged entirely in, imported sherry or port barrels. We use a lot of Oregon Pinot Noir barrels, and as you'll see later in the tasting, we also use a lot of stout, like imperial stout casks. If you've had a whiskey finished whiskey aged stouts. Those barrels come from whiskey, and we get those barrels back and make a stout finished whiskey. So, so that's that was in every category you see in our definitions and our standards of identity. You'll see that it's really geared towards fostering innovation and encouraging participation rather than discouraging participation.
So part of that is having to say you can finish in any barrel. So if you look at bourbon, if you take a bourbon and finish it in a port barrel, you can't call it bourbon anymore. So that's kind of an important point to put here for the American Single Malt.
Yeah. I mean, like you said at the beginning, if you send a cola application into 3 different folks at the TTB, and you'll get 3 different answers. There isn't a lot of consistency. Sometimes if you are finishing in a stout cask, some people are able to call that straight malt whiskey. Some have to call it distilled spirit specialty. And so it's is that a flavoring or is that an oak? There's a lot of sort of inside baseball around this, and there's a lot of inconsistency in the enforcement and application of the standards. So,
if you can just give us a quick rundown on your malt. Why is it different from the first 2 we tasted? I mean, it's got a clearly different.
Yeah, so I'd love to tell you about it. Each of these I think expresses its region, its style, its philosophy. Whereas especially say Colin's whiskey is, he's from Mesquite country, and he's really highlighting that. It's a nice, beautiful, like subtle kiss of mesquite smoke on that. For us, we're really trying to create a whiskey of this Northwest provenance. So, and what does that mean? So in the Northwest, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, a little bit into Western Montana is where most of the malting barley is grown. Most of the 2-row is grown in the US there. And so we have local maltings in Idaho and in Washington. We get all of our malted barley from, not all of it, we get the lion's share from Great Western Malting, which is just across the Columbia River in Vancouver, Washington. They've been there since 1933. Mostly what we're using is a blend of Metcalf and Copeland, which are both American Malt Barley Association approved varieties. And the malt is then kilned off at a slightly higher temperature than a normal, brewery base malt. So it's a pale ale malt. So it's for any brewers out there, it's about a 4 color level of 4, and so that higher malt temperature, that higher kiln off temperature, gives it a little more biscuity, nutty, roasty flavor than the light malt. We ferment, and then sort of to complete the notion of Northwest provenance, we are really a craft brewing hub. And I started, my background was in brewing. I started in craft brewing in 1990, 13 years before I started the distillery. And I started the distillery to make malt whiskey that was a reflection of that beer style. So we use an ale yeast. We use typically the Sierra Nevada pale ale yeast strain, the 1056 or 001, depending on what catalog you're using. But that yeast produces a very fruity, a lot of pear, a lot of apple, a lot of raspberry, a lot of floral notes too. You get rose and jasmine. And then because we put so much effort into the fermentation, nice, cool, long fermentation, we don't want to strip a lot of that flavor off. So we have very little reflux on our stills, very short heads. So we distill to a fairly low proof. That also helps, besides capturing those nice fermentation esters, it also brings through a lot of the sort of some of the heavier congeners that give you a lot of that texture and what was Jared's mouthfeel. I love the mouthfeel. So and then so on the nose you get a lot of that like baking spice, caramel, vanilla. On the palate you get more of the fruit, and it's got just this nice lingering spicy finish.
Definitely a pleasant dram. Nice to go with a little bit of a dark chocolate.
Oh yeah.
So next we're going to move on with Alley 6, another local distillery here. We have Jason Jorgensen, the distiller, founder there, and he's going to talk to us through his product and where his source of barley comes from.
Yeah, nice to see faces. It's kind of been gloomy around here with our nice fire scene and chaos that goes along with our pandemic and all that fun jazz. So really is nice to see everybody. So our whiskey,
Again, let me go back here. This is a sample 7 for everybody. Sample number 7.
Oh, it's empty. That's a good sign.
Yeah, all my bottles are empty.
So we, our background, we're kind of homebrew hobbyists that evolved into this drunk debauchery of distilled spirits. So what we've done is basically taken single variety of malted barleys that are from, not from America, which is maybe not so much an American single malt whiskey, but we look as it's made here in the States. It's made by us as one distiller, and very much typical as a single malt whiskey should be made, but just with grains from different regions of the world. So this one in particular is made from grain from Heidelberg, Germany. So this grain is a special malted barley that was intended to go into beer, but we really like the characteristic that it contributed into a single malt. And we've done 7 different kinds of single malts that have had, different toasting levels from different regions of the world. It's just to kind of like showcase these different flavor profiles that would come from these grains, which we kind of geeked out and thought was pretty exciting. But this one in particular was more of a traditional single malt whiskey style, it seemed to us. So this has a tasting note to ourselves as Highland single malt whiskey and an Irish whiskey had a baby and brought it to the States. It's our little immigrant, and we love it dearly. But I think for grain wise, I'm very excited about this, the commission. And I want to learn more about this. I'm not too privy about the whole thing, but I'm very excited to see that there is that out there, and that I can call and geek out with you guys now. So I think it'd be fun. But to see what your feedback is on using malts from different parts of the world, but still made here in the States, and considered
You're working hard, huh?
I'm working really hard, yes. I'm sweating.
So
Crazy.
I don't believe the commission has put any restrictions on where the products come from. I mean, people
There's no
bring peated barley from Scotland, and I don't know if that's just something they had. Can anyone tune in and chime in on that? What's the reason for not putting any restriction there?
I think as long as it's mashed,
I left some of that.
if it's
stuff
mashed
in the
at the
car.
distillery here in America, then I think that,
we're down to that.
Yeah.
People are looking
I
around.
agree with that. That's the American way.
I got bored.
We bring
Yeah.
everything
Most
from
of it's up
outside
now.
in and create these amazing, spirits from grains from all over the world. I think that says enough right there.
Well, yeah, we were talking on the last meeting we had that I think there's only 2 distilleries. This is a big misunderstanding, but I think there's only 2 scotches that are actually made with Scottish barley. The rest of it is from elsewhere. So, and beer's known this, to speak to Christian's background. Like, I mean, nobody would dare to try and say this isn't local beer just because the hops came from someplace else or the grain came from someplace else. We don't all live in barley growing regions, and
good point.
yeah. Anyway, that's definitely not a consideration.
Right, and again, I think we wanted to encourage innovation, not discourage it. And yeah, there's some fantastic malt coming from the U.S., but there's also some fantastic malt coming from Scotland and Germany and Australia. So why why handcuff ourselves?
Yeah, I agree. And you know, the drunk monks have cultivated this over hundreds of years, and if you can't fornicate, you got to drink. So, I mean, it makes sense, right?
All right, so
Is that the name of your next whiskey, Drunk Monk?
I'm sorry.
That should be the next whiskey. Is the drunk monk? Yeah.
Got my vote.
So Jason, also, isn't your malt also finish or in barrels which had hold rye whiskey? So you picked up
Yes.
a little bit of the
You get that spice of the rye, most definitely. Yeah. So this whiskey that you're drinking, and like I mentioned, we've done 7 different kinds of single malt whiskey, but this one is now created as our flagship single malt. But this one is aged in our used rye whiskey barrels, which was kind of interesting. You do get a little bit of that spice of rye, but being that rye has taken out quite a few of the characteristics of the barrel, this is showcasing more of the grain versus more of the barrel. So I kind of like that. You get that malty, that toastedness of the grain, and you know, you do get a little bit of that characteristic from the barrel, but it's not overwhelming.
All right, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Jason. Now we're going to move on to few spirits. This is going to be sample number 5. Sample number 5. This we have Paul, who's going to take us through this. One of the members of the commission, and he's going to tell us why these rules don't stifle creativity.
You know, I think the key is, you know, a lot of what everybody's been talking about, from Jason to Jared and Christian, is we're trying to protect the consumer more than we're trying to protect the distiller. And so what we're trying to do is set up standards where the person who's buying it has some comfort in what they're getting, but doesn't make us make our products any particular way within reason. You know, you can still make whatever whiskey you want to make. It just may be that it doesn't qualify as single malt. And there's nothing wrong with whiskeys that are not single malt. I mean, we make primarily bourbon and rye. We mostly make stuff that's not single malt. And there's nothing good or nothing bad inherently about any way you're doing it. For our single malt, we really want to focus on the flavors of the grain and the yeast. You know, a lot of like what Krista was talking about, but we use all used cooperage rather than using any new. We don't use a whole lot of finishing barrels. That's the way we want to make our stuff. And if you talk to 10 members of the Single Malt Commission, you're going to find 10 guys that make their whiskey 10 different ways. And some people make their whiskey several different ways, like Jason was just talking about. Nobody on the commission wants to place value judgments on how somebody else makes their whiskey. We're just trying to set up some sort of a guideposts or bumpers to help define what this category means. And if the stuff you're making doesn't fit that, that's awesome. It's just not American single malt, which is fine.
Okay, so Paul, now tell us how you made your whiskey. Again, what's so great about this is all malts, all American single malt, but distinctly different flavors.
Yeah, 100% malt, but we use cherry smoked malt rather than other stuff. You're talking about all the different regions. We don't have a lot of peat around here. We don't have a lot of other stuff, but we got some cherry wood trees, or cherry trees made of wood, I guess. To me, it just makes more sense to use stuff that is here. Because it's close, it's local, we can get cherry wood smoked malt. It's a minority of the malt that's in the whiskey. It's only about 25% of it is smoked. And I think that's what kind of helps to give it some texture without intense smoky flavors. Certainly we're not trying to compete with a lot of the smoky malts. Colkegan is certainly a fantastic example of a really nice, not heavily smoked, but more aggressively smoked than ours. We wanted that kind of soft, somewhat sweet after dinner dram for folks that want to drink their dessert rather than eat it. Like, for example, me.
Thank you so much, Paul. Appreciate that. Now we're going to move on to Arizona with Del Beck single malt. This is Stephen Paul is going to talk to us about his creation here and talk to us will we have, will regions emerge from the US? Let's see, do we have is Stephen Paul on?
Yeah, Stephen. Yeah, thanks. So yeah, I'm gonna really shoot from the hip here because as far as one
Sample
style,
number one, I'm sorry, sample number one.
you know, actually, almost everybody here so far has touched on regionality. Christian has, you know, is kind of playing off the kind of brewing and wine heritage of Oregon. Paul just mentioned, you know, he lives around cherry trees. So I think that, you know, I can't imagine there being an American style, because we're so diverse. But as far as like a couple of areas that I'm somewhat familiar with, the Pacific Northwest, you know, Christian's playing off the brewing heritage, like, and using stout casks and IPA casks to age in, and using different malts. I know, you know, Matt Hoffman up at Westland is digging up Washington peat and having that malted. That's got to contribute to a style. He's also using some native oak to age in. And then, you know, up in the Pacific Northwest, you guys also have, you know, unique aging conditions, like climatic conditions. And Colin, Jared, and myself, we have down in the desert Southwest in Texas, we have a whole different climate. So it's pretty drastic diurnal shifts. Like Colin was mentioning, we'll go from 40 degrees in the morning to 80 degrees in the afternoon a lot of times. And so it's really severe. And then, you know, down here, we started this whole project because we wanted to make a very regional whiskey using mesquite wood from the desert Southwest. So we actually malt our own barley for our Dorado. We're using a scarlet variety from southern Colorado. There's two-row barley likes to grow at either high elevations or upper latitudes. And so we're at 2,300 feet here, so we can't really grow two-row barley very well. So yeah, I mean, so styles, I think there's going to be styles that emerge, and we're just going to have to watch how this evolves. And it's pretty fun to see the innovation and the kind of attempts at regionalism. So yeah, as far as our Dorado, we do malt our own barley. We do, like Colin, we blend in a little bit of unsmoked malt, commercial two-row malt from the Pacific Northwest, actually. So our Dorado is going to be a little more mesquite forward than the Colkegan. I love the Colkegan, by the way, Colin. It's an awesome whiskey. One of the things
as is yours, Stephen, the Southwest rocking for mesquite smoked whiskey.
Yeah. One of the things that, so sometimes people want to compare us to an Islay Scotch. And Paul touched on this a little bit. One of the things that I don't like about the heavily peated Islay Scotches is that kind of iodine astringency on the finish. And mesquite and cherry wood as well are a lot softer on the palate, and they don't give you that, you know, heavy kind of Band-Aid. And I have friends who absolutely love that. So I'm not disparaging it, but yeah, mesquite is a lot softer on the palate than peat. So yeah, yeah, you're gonna get, you know, tobacco and chocolate on the nose. I know you've got some different things. People, it's always a little dicey telling people what they're gonna get, but anyway, yeah. And then the soft kind of tannins and toffee, you know, underlying the mesquite smoke. We're aging in new oak, and we do, except for a couple of special releases that we do about three or four times a year, and we've used Sauterne casks. We have a big sherry butt aging right now. We've used cognac and Madeira casks and Calvados. Those are all lots of fun.
Okay. Hey, thank you so much, Stephen, for taking us through that. Again, another different flavor profile. Again, we're showing that American Single Malt defines a category, but it does not define a flavor. There's so much wide variety that we can get from this. So next, we're going to move on to 10th Street. Virag Saxena is going to talk to us about his wonderful creation and talk to us about why Scotland legislates a minimum of 3 years and why the commission is not putting an age limit on here. And again, our sample here for 10th Street is going to be sample number 2.
Thanks, Doug. Thank you, everyone. I can't speak on behalf of the commission on why the commission believes why we should not have any statement, but I can give you my belief why they should not be a legislative statement. There's a common story told in the circles about the age statement, and it turns out that originally most of the Scotch did not have an age statement. In fact, till the World Wars, there was no age statement. And during the World War, what was going on was two things were happening. One was they wanted to produce more fuel for the war effort. The second was they wanted to restrict the amount of drunkenness in their officers' mess. So in officers' mess, the only thing which was consumed was Scotch. And so then they legislated Scotch has to be aged at least 2 years so they could restrict the amount of liquor available for the mess. And at some point of time, that got raised up to 3 years. So that's how it wasn't something which came about because of quality. It came about because of wartime rationing of it, why the age came. The other thing which has happened is there is a lot of creativity on how you take cuts. So you can take late cuts, you can take heavy cuts, you can take light cuts. And these things come in age at different stages. These also age at different rates depending on what temperature you're aging them at. There are common known rule in chemistry and chemical engineering that for each, I believe, 10 degrees Celsius temperature rise, the chemical reactions approximately double. In San Jose over here, the angels are really greedy. As they are in some other parts, we lose about 10 to 12% a year on average. Compare that to Scotland, we're losing about 3% a year. And at the higher temperatures. So when we started making our whiskey, people asked us how long we are going to age it, and our answer was as long as it takes. Some of our whiskeys are still aging. Some we were able to release after merely a year. And what you're tasting today right now, that is a STR. And that was the first release of STR, which was aged for a little over a year, about 15 months or so. And what you will find is, so when we started making
Okay, looks like we lost Virag there. So
this whiskey, this was our second whiskey. Yeah? Can you hear me?
Okay, you back? Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so sorry. So I can try joining on a phone. You know, we make great whiskey over here, but our internet is not the best. So
tell us a little bit about the STR. What is STR?
STR is a second whiskey. Our first whiskey is a peated whiskey. The malt comes in from Scotland. And as you know, there are a lot of people who don't like peated whiskeys. So this is a whiskey which is a reach out to people who like bourbon. We wanted most of our whiskeys, practically all of our whiskey is aged in used bourbon casks. This whiskey, and some of it is finished in then other local wine casks, which you will be tasting later on our second whiskey. So this particular whiskey we wanted to kick up the wood a little bit, but we didn't want as much wood based on our cuts as you would get from a new wood. So we did a compromise. It's a technique pioneered by late Jim Swan of shaving, toasting, and recharring the cask, which kicks up the wood profile a little bit. So you will get notes which are reminiscent of bourbon, but you will taste that this is still very much a single malt. So it's an unpeated barley sourced from American West, aged in shaved, toasted, and recharred whiskey cask. Enjoy. You will see notes of caramel, a little bit of spice, something which you can open up by adding a little bit of water.
Okay, thank you so much, Parag. Appreciate you taking us through that. Another spectacular whiskey. We're still waiting for things to open up so we can do our blending class down there at the distillery. Next up, we're going to move to Stranahan's. And with the Stranahans, we have their, let's see, sample number, what is that? St. George.
Number 8.
Okay, so number 8 for Stranahan's, and this is a sherry cask finish. So we want to, and here we're going to talk, we have Rick Edwards, who's been a long time in the industry, a long time ambassador for malts. And so he's going to tell us give us a rundown. What is American Single Malt versus Scotch?
I tell you what, after spending the last 23 years working on Scottish distilleries, pretty much every region, it was great for me to come over to Colorado and really dive into the American Single Malts category after spending so many years with Scottish Single Malts. Really, you got to look at a lot of different things. Your grain types, your mash bills, your distillation processes, cask types. One of the biggest thing I think that people confuse Scottish single malt and American malt whiskey is using the term American malt whiskey. Somebody else hit on this earlier about malt whiskey. We've got to really define what single malt whiskey is. Malt whiskey in America can be 51%. You know, in Scotland, SWA, it's got to be 100% barley. Also, the casks in America, we can use new casks. Over at Stranahan's, we use brand new, never been used from ISC over in Lebanon, Missouri. Level 3 char. But then what we like to do is something a little different afterwards. So we want to be able to take and add the ages of our secondary maturations onto it. For instance, the whiskey we're drinking right now, Stranahan's Sherry Cask. It's a 4-year-old Stranahan's, straight 4-year-old, no blending of years in there, whereas our original is a 2, 3, 4, and 5. It's a straight 4-year-old, and then finished in Oloroso sherry butts from Andalusia. And so we take that secondary maturation, that finishing period, and we really kind of change those flavors coming out of what we normally get out of Stranahan's. We're going to be getting more, I call Christmas cake flavors. You're going to get raisins, sultanas, overripe cherries. You're going to get apples. One of the things that I really get out of these Oloroso casks coming from Stranahan's distillery is there's almost a eucalyptus note and almost a cayenne pepper note. So there's this peppery mintiness that really shines through on the sherry cask that I don't necessarily see on Stranahan's original or the Diamond Peak.
Okay, thank you so much, Rick, for taking us through that. A wonderful tasting there. Next, we're going to move on to, going to get a good amount of smoke here. We're going to move to the Corsair Triple Smoke. This is a distillery well known for breaking the rules. How do they make an American single malt? But they still want to break the rules. And here, I think, Ryan, did you make it back in time for us to go over this product? I don't want to see. Okay, so the Corsair triple smoke. Let's see what sample number is that. We're going to I'll talk to you a little bit about this one.
Number 10.
Yeah, number 10. Yes, there we go. So,
Hey, Douglas, it's Ryan from Corsair.
hey, Ryan, saved me. All right.
I don't
Thanks.
know if I saved you or not, but I certainly rushed back from dinner to make this. So I do apologize. I'm a little bit late. Do you mind if I jump in here?
I would love it. Just take over.
Awesome. So yeah, I'm Ryan from Corsair Distillery. We're out in Nashville, Tennessee. You know, when it comes to single malt or any spirit, for that matter, for us, we're kind of all about breaking the rules. Don't get me wrong. I love the rules and regulations that come along with Scotch whiskey and stuff like that. It provides consistency, consumer protection, an economic monopoly for Scotland, all the heritage and pride and all that stuff that comes along with it. But if you look at the consumption trends over the last 30 years, you can see that consumers are really looking for something different, and that's what Corsair is about. So, you know, with that, why don't we try Triple Smoke from Corsair? This is our new pack. Sorry, I think it's backwards there, but I think all of you guys are in Northern California, so you might not have seen the new pack just yet, but it's arriving this week. So Corsair is a 100% two-row malted barley. And we stop that malting process with 3 different fuels. We use peat from Scotland, beechwood from Germany, and cherrywood from Wisconsin. It's not 3 amounts of smoke. It's not, you know, it's not overly smoky. It's just 3 different types of smoke. We really want the smoke to be a flavor profile as opposed to the only thing that you get out of it. So it's actually very muted on the smoke side. We wanted to make a whiskey that was palatable to even an entry-level whiskey person, and also try to bridge the gap between Scotch and American bourbon. So Triple Smoke is 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 equal parts peat, beechwood, and cherrywood smoked barley, all mashed, distilled at the same time. We only use 15 and 30 gallon new American oak, number 3 char as well, just like you heard on the last one. So it's a bit of a mild char, but we only use 15 and 30 gallon casks. It's about 75% 15 gallon and 25% 30 gallon. By using smaller casks, we can get some age on the liquid pretty quickly. So that means that our cuts need to be extremely lean and very clean, because they're not going to be able to mellow out over time, because with a smaller barrel, you're going to get aged faster. You don't want it to sit in a 15 gallon barrel for 5 years, say. So instead of allowing 5 years of mellowing, we just take an extremely lean cut on the liquid itself. So on the nose, you should get some mild peat. We control the amount of smoke quite harshly, so to speak. We're about 18 parts per million versus like a Lagavulin where you're going to get about 500 parts per million of smoke. So you'll get a little bit of peat, a lot of malt, because it is 100% two-row malted barley. And then on the palate, I get a little bit of peat first, but then it's followed up by a little bit of that cherry wood. Obviously very malty. By using new American oak, you're going to get a lot of that honey, a little bit of the citrus as well. Very mild whiskey. It's 80 proof. It's very sessionable. This is the daily drinker that we make.
Thank you, Ryan, so much. Yeah, I mean, the name Triple Smoke might kind of throw you off, because I'm expecting from the name a much more heavier peat, but it's a well balanced. It's not overdone, and it's just mainly the balance of different types of smoke. Very nicely done. So the next we're going to move on to the St. George Baller. This is okay. I think sample. What sample was that? So we're sample number 4, the St. George Baller. Pour that out, give yourself a little time to let it aerate. So this one, give it a nice nose smell there. This is a quite unique product here. That's that strong fruity smell. So what they've done here, they've taken a single malt, they've distilled it in pot stills. It's aged 3 or 4 years in bourbon cask. You can tell from the light color of the liquid. Then they bourbon cask, also French oak cask, but they also finished it in cask which held umushu. Imush. I can't say it. Imushiyu, which is a Japanese style of fruit stone liqueur. So kind of a plum smell. You definitely get that smell out of it. This product was designed to be used as for making highballs. So thus the name of baller. And it's got a little bit of a smoke to it also. And so it's pleasant. You can drink it on its own. Definitely, you get the definitely get the fruitiness there, a little bit of the sweetness, touch of maltiness, a little lingering fruit, lingering smoky finish. So quite pleasant, nice little dram there to end out the session here and get us ready for the VIPs. Again, thank you everyone who for joining us. I hope you learned a lot about what we have here. If you want to ask any questions right now about the commission, its purpose, and where it's where we hope to go from here, please unmute yourself, ask any questions if you like. And so again, let's sum it up here. What is American Single Malts? Is basically it's 100% malted, 100% malted barley made in America. It's not, but
at a single distillery.
Sorry?
At a single distillery.
At a single distillery. But the variation of flavor profile, so it's not like saying, hey, this is a Japanese malt, which traditionally is kind of a lighter malt, or a Highland malted, which you expect a certain thing. It's a wide range of flavors to come from. So we call it American Single Malt, but it's not pigeonholed. And I mean, there's so much to go here between using new casks. So some people like using a fresh cask because it gives it more of a cross, a little more bourbon essence to it. So you get more of the tannins. And so now it's easier for a bourbon drinker to more of a bourbon malt. And some people like to do the used cask because now, it's a lighter product. It's closer to what you expect from a Scotch. And so it's a wonderful category. And as recently at our Whiskies of the World competition, we had judges saying, wow, they're just blown away by the product coming out from America, saying, man, these are valid alternatives to Scotch for the people who are Scotch snobs. And so we've come a long ways. This commission is again trying to keep things, as they said, you make the regulations, you define it yourself, and you don't have to worry about someone else coming along and screwing it up. Again, do we have any questions anybody want to ask our panel?
Douglas, I did want to just kind of interject because I kind of ran through our sherry cask. For the viewers that are watching this, shoot some questions out about the differences between Scotch whiskey and American Single Malt, and if there's any question. I paused for effect to kind of bring in some questions, but then we moved on. So I just want to make sure that everybody's clear on differences. And when people ask me, what's the difference between Scottish Single Malt and American Single Malt, my response is usually, where do I begin? Because there's so many differences already from the two that it's not America making it necessarily in a Scottish style. It's almost like kissing cousins between a bourbon and the Scottish style. So I just want to make sure everybody's clear. And if they have any questions, to type it in.
Yeah, talk about the difference between the bourbons and the single malts.
Right. Well, the whole definitions and the federal identity, standards of identity, basically is more focused on the bourbons, whereas the Scotch Whisky Association and the regulations in Scotland That right there is very different. And I think this is one of the reasons why we need to identify American Single Malt, is to start to kind of pull away from the standards of identity for bourbon. Because everybody right now is kind of like, well, let's just throw it into a bourbon category. And that's what I was kind of trying to say about malt whiskey versus single malt whiskey. And we're talking about production strengths, bottling strengths, filling strengths into the barrel at 125, using new oak. We've already talked a little bit about this. In Scotland, there is no rule about if it's new oak or used oak. Primarily, it's bourbon casks, it is sherry casks, it is rum casks that we're typically using. 90% of the casks that we get in Scotland are coming from the American bourbon industry. However, for us as American Single Malt, we're using that brand new level 3 char coming in. And just do your homework, I would say, as well, because there's just so many differences. And everybody was kind of slapping me on the back saying, hey, after 23 years of working in Scotland or on Scottish whiskeys, now you're doing American whiskeys. Is there much difference? Tons of difference. And we just need to make sure that we can identify those.
Are there similarities too?
Yeah, there's the similarities for me, and this kind of harkens back to some of the other conversations we were having about the barley. And one of the things that I think is important about American Single Malt is that it must be 100% malted barley, and it must be mashed at the distillery. Doesn't necessarily have to be malted at the distillery or from that distillery. We can outsource it from other countries. At Stranahan's, we're sourcing our barley 15 miles away from our distillery, but that doesn't mean that it's got to be a Colorado Rocky Mountain single malt where all the barley must come from your hometown. I think it's great that we can use other barleys, but it's got to be 100%.
Hey, Rick, I have a question about some of the difference between a single malt from Scotland. So I understand they have to age 12 years, right, to call it a single malt?
3 years. 3 years.
Is it 3 years?
Yeah, by law. Single malt Scotch whiskey must be aged for a minimum of 3 years, but in American whiskey, there is no age statement. We don't have an age statement for American single malt. However, I know at Stranahan's, we're not doing anything less than 2, but we're taking 2, 3, 4, and 5-year-olds and marrying them together. But the Scotch law for single malt is 3 years. However, you're not going to see a 3-year-old single malt necessarily. There's a few out there, but and that's in SWA rule regulations right there. Because remember that there is single malt whiskey, single grain whiskey, blended malt whiskey, blended grain whiskey, and blended Scotch. And blended Scotch is a category outside of blended malt or blended grain. But whiskey out of Scotland must be 3 years minimum. A lot of people will say it's 3 years in a day. That's not, I think that kind of came out of Ireland, that 3 years in a day. But I also know, working on my distilleries that I had in Ireland, that 3 year in a day is not necessarily true either. It's just 3 years. And straight whiskey must be minimum 2, but anything between 2 and 4 must be aged. However, we have most of our straight whiskeys out of America coming in at about 4 years old and up. Okay?
But it is interesting that they will sell whiskey in Scotland, which doesn't meet that criteria. Whiskey which has not even been made in pot stills, basically straight whiskey which is made in, vodka flavored with essence. And you can go to
You mean continuous still?
No, yeah. I mean grain whiskey or neutral grain spirits. Neutral grain spirits with blended whiskey, basically. Most of the blended whiskey which is sold there in Scotland, not like the Johnny Walker, is actually neutral grain spirit mixed in with a little bit of Scotch and sold. So you can go to a grocery store over there in Islay and you can buy that whiskey. Interestingly, which they
It's not neutral grain spirit. I mean, if you're talking about, because I worked for Johnny Walker for 11 years.
No, I'm saying Johnny Walker doesn't have neutral grain spirit. Johnny Walker has grain whiskey mixed with malt whiskeys, with single malts. But there is neutral grain spirits which is mixed to make whiskey, and which is sold there, same way as the whiskey which is sold in India, which is neutral grain spirits, which is mixed with other whiskey, and that is sold in Scotland.
So I'm not doubting that there is that, but to be called Scotch, it's not neutral grain spirit. It's grain whiskey, and there's a big difference.
What I'm saying is Scotland has set those standards for Scotch.
Yes.
But what I was pointing out was that there is a discrepancy that in Scotland you can buy these whiskies which are actually made in Scotland, and this is the cheapest bargain basement whiskeys, which are basically neutral grain spirits mixed in with a little bit of whiskey, which are being sold for two quid a bottle.
Can't be called scotch, mate. Can't be called
It's called
scotch.
whiskey. I said it's called whiskey.
Whiskey, yes, yeah. Can't be called scotch if there's a neutral grain spirit in there. Grain whiskey, yes. Grain whiskey and malt whiskey together, blended category. But I understand what you're saying. I was misunderstanding what you were saying. I thought you were referring to it as scotch. But here's the other thing, you guys, is there is very much an established definition of Scotch whiskey. There's an established definition of Scottish single malt whiskey, Scottish blended whiskey. I think, like this whole conversation, we definitely need to have a categorization of American single malt too. Did I just lose you guys?
Yeah, we lost the video.
Yep, I think I just lost you.
Just your video.
But we can hear you.
Great.
Hey.
Anyway, I just wanted to make sure that I just didn't, jump in, talk about the flavor profiles of Stranahan's sherry cask, transferring into those Olorosos, and not really spending a little bit of time concentrating on Scotch whiskey versus American single malt.
Hey, we appreciate your input here, and it's been very informative. We're going to now move on to for our VIP customers. And again, for anybody who didn't get the VIP, you can order these an ounce samples or bigger, or get a whole bottle from Shovel's Bar if you want to enjoy this. Or you can actually, all these bottles, you can buy them all from I'll send you out a link for that. You can buy them all from Shovels. Other good places to pick up products, of course, there's a whiskey shop in San Francisco. Bitters and Bottles is a good place for getting less known products like or less available, not like the Colkegan. And but now we're going to move on to what we're calling our VIPs. We're going to do the Westward Stout Cask. Again, this, I believe, Christian can take us through this, what the difference is between this and the last one we just tried. So this is going to be our, what's labeled VIP 2, the Westward Stout Cask.
Yeah, and I mean, well, you all have that wee little bottle. I brought the 5 liter with me here, so I've got plenty. But the main difference is, again, this is the stout cask is really an homage to the Northwest brewing scene.
Want to go out for your salad?
On a basic level, what we've done is when we empty the Westward whiskey, our core expression, when we dump the barrels at about, say, 4 to 5 years, we give those empty barrels to our friends in the brewing industry around the Northwest. There's a number of breweries who are making whiskey barrel aged stouts. We don't steam our barrels, so they're very, very juicy. There's a couple gallons of whiskey in the staves. They get these barrels, they age their typically imperial stouts, things in the range of 8 to 11% alcohol. They typically age them for say 9 to 18 months. And when they're done, they bottle up their beer and they give the barrels back. And we take then our core whiskey, our currently aging whiskey, and we give it a final 1 year of finish in those used stout casks. And it's really interesting. I mean, I find it fascinating. It's the same spirit. If you still have some of the core Westward American single malt left to taste, it's really instructive to taste these two side by side, because the only difference, I mean, it's the same barley malt, same fermentation, same yeast, same stills. The stout cask has roughly, say, a further 1 year of age on it in barrel, but really the main difference is that it's got that 1 year in stout casks. And this is what I love about what I do, is that it's sort of this is magic. It's impossible to put your finger on why this happens, but while the core Westward is this very robust, very rich, very textural and sweet whiskey, something about the time of having that stout in the barrels for a year has changed the very qualities, the very chemistry of the wood in those barrels. And so with that final 1 year of aging, of finishing, it makes the whiskey more structured, I would say more elegant, a little more dry. The fruit still comes through. You still get the big, pear, Bartlett pear, and banana, and all the baking spice, but it's more kind of defined, more, like I said, more structured. You get a little more chocolate on it. And it's not like we've just added stout to whiskey. You don't really taste the stout at all. But what you get on the finish is a little bit of that roasted barley. You get a little bit more chocolate, and it's really more on the finish than anything.
Christian, thank you so much for that. But yeah, I mean, part what I love about it is is it the finish. I definitely get the stout there. I thought it was at the beginning, but you're calling it the finish. It definitely, I mean, when it's done, I got the stout. That's what's fun about it. And then combining the younger brother of beer with its older brother, English brother of whiskey.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, definitely you taste the beer all the way through our line because, like I said, we have very long, very slow, cool ferments, and we have very little reflux. So we're really, instead of thinking in terms of cleaning up the beer, we're really just concentrating it because we want to preserve all those flavors that we've created during fermentation, and because for a variety of reasons we have very little ethyl acetate, for instance, so we don't have to take a big heads cut, and we don't have to worry about that throughout the distillation and aging process. So that allows us to have that less reflux and a sort of younger whiskey too.
Hey, thank you again so much for that. Now we're going to move on to our last whiskey, our VIP one here, which is the 10th Street port. It's a port cask holiday edition. This, I believe, might have been the last bottle of it. So the difference between this whiskey and all the other ones is you can order all the other whiskeys through Shovels. You probably get it maybe through the whiskey shop or Bitters and Bottles, but you get it through Shovels. This one you cannot get. This is probably the last bottle from their holiday edition for last year. So savor it, sip it, savor it, and we'll talk to Virag will tell us about this piece. But yeah, enjoy this. It's not available.
Douglas, you must have really deep connections because this is all I have left. And you managed to find a full bottle somewhere. So what I would say is don't drink all of it yet. Drink a bit of it to taste it. And then what I would like you to do is add a little bit of water to it. Now, this is where these mysteries of whiskey come in because, we worked hard on making a whiskey taste a certain way. But we discovered in this whiskey, when you add some water, it opens up beautifully. I can't explain it, why it happens. And maybe some of the experts could explain it. Why is it that finishing a whiskey in a port cask does that? So this was a holiday edition release. We released it last December for the holidays. It was one cask which we had made and it was all gone. And I don't know where Doug found the bottle. We have more which is aging, which will come out probably in October of this year. Something which we released just now is a wine cask release, local winery, the Pinot Noir cask. We finished bottles in there. Look at the rich red color. It's a fruit bomb. But right now we are going to go taste some port cask. And then when you add a little bit of water, see how the taste changes. So this is what we are doing, and basically these are all finished in local wine cask. This is a local port cask. As I said, we are just releasing a local Pinot Noir cask. For those of you who are really adventurous and want some, I have some whiskey which I aged in a Chardonnay cask. I will never do it again, ever. But there is some whiskey which is sitting out there, which we finished in a Chardonnay cask.
Why will you never do that again?
So, did you taste it last time you were at the distillery?
Yes, huh?
Think of French cheese, like that really smelly French cheese. Now, I guess some people might have a palate for it, but I don't know if you want to do that again with the Chardonnay cask. So, and after we had done it, one of our advisors actually said, "Why didn't I tell you never to age something in Chardonnay?" And I was like, I must have missed that. No,
That's funny.
So,
Some of the best single malts I've ever had were aged in Chardonnay. I had a Chichibu or Ichiro's cask aged entirely in Chardonnay barrels. It was fantastic. So it was inspiring. So, but I think it just depends on the spirit that goes in, whether it's new make or I think you want to put new make into a Chardonnay cask.
Possibly. So this is a peated whiskey, unlike the previous one which you had, which is an unpeated. The peat malt comes from Scotland. I tried peating it here, but California gets too warm for me to get any peat level into my malt. So we get peated malt in. Those of you who are tasting it and wondering about the peat level, this is actually peated. So this one is peated at 35 ppm. This is not an Isla peat, so you're not going to get the iodine and seaweed. You're going to get more of the heathery, mossy peat over there. Even in the normal whiskey, which is not aged in the peat, people get that sweetness, which is basically what the peat is supposed to be. That nice peat finish, meaning I guess people could call it a jungle fire. I think it's sweet peat. So this, you will see the peat in there, it's hiding in there behind, and so the layering is basically you got the peat, you got the malt, and then you got the podcast.
Hey, Varag, again, thank you so much for being here. Kind of a little bit of note going back to the aging and aging requirements. I know the first year in our Whiskies World competition, you had a product you entered, which was probably a year or less, and it beat out everything else that was twice the age of it. So yeah, aging it's really, it's tough to put a rule on that because it's really dependent on the spirit that goes into it, the environment of which it's being aged, and so is just a whole new realm there.
Absolutely. So it depends a lot on the cuts you're taking, your fermentation temperatures. Meaning, if you have butyrate going in, that stuff is not going to taste nice in a year. That stuff will taste nice in 4 years, 5 years, or longer. So the cuts we are taking is stuff which will age faster, but it will not have the same complexity as your 12 or 14-year-olds will have, because those take time to develop, right? Once the oxidation happens and the esterification happens, that takes time.
Fascinating. It's always fun to learn all the technical, the geeky stuff there. So again, thank you all for joining in, for being here for this American Single Malts. Hopefully you have a new appreciation for what everybody's doing here to make our lives more palatable, to make it enjoyable. And again, when you go to your favorite local liquor store, you always ask for the American Single Malt section, which they probably won't have, but the more you ask, the sooner it becomes a reality.